Okay, for this graph, it's essentially the same, but now we adjusted it for inflation. So it's the same graph, federal surplus or deficit, and these new points represent, they are now measured for inflation. So to do that, what I had to do was I took the surplus or deficit for any given year, federal surplus or deficit. I multiplied it by the CPI, was known as the Consumer Price Index. The CPI I took on this graph here, I took the CPI for 2023, February 2023, which was, if I could get it, 301.648. So on this graph, the federal surplus or deficit from the last graph multiplied by 301.648 divided by the CPI for any given year. So now this graph now represents, each point represents, it's adjusted for inflation. It's the same concept. Anything above zero, this black line here, anything above zero represents federal revenue exceeding expenditures, which is a surplus. Anything below represents a deficit. Revenue is less than expenditures, or expenditures exceeds revenue. So each point is the same. This graph starts at 1950. Everything that I've mentioned in the last graph, the reasons and the causes for the dips, like such as the shaded areas you see like right here and right here, these shaded areas in gray represent recessions, and each time there's a recession, there's an increase in government spending, so which we see a further incline into a deficit. Because most of the years throughout American history have been, the federal government being in a deficit. It's very few years throughout American history where our revenue exceeded expenditure. Okay, so now with that said, now that we know that these points here per year are much more accurate, and that they paint a much clearer picture of what the economy was like at the time. We could kind of analyze them. So let's go to 2020. In 2020, the deficit for that year was negative 3,650,366. And on the first graph that we described, where it wasn't measured for inflation in 2020, negative 3,132,457. So we see how the actual value of the dollar at the time, we can see what the economy was actually like. And so if we go to nationalpriorities.org, we see the definition for inflation. We see inflation is an increase in prices. Inflation occurs when the average price level across the economy, not just for a few goods, increases. So if the annual rate of inflation is 3%, then something you buy for $10 this year might be the cost of $10 the next year. So for inflation, when we look at the graph, for example, like the graph that I just described, the with adjusted for inflation, we see the value of the dollar at the time, like the overall, not just for individual markets, but for the overall markets. And we see how essentially this graph and these points per year, how the economy was essentially doing at the time.